Hello there, I'm Guildmaster Dan, and welcome to the Fourth Wall. Alright, now we got a lot to talk about today, so we're going to go ahead and get on with it. We're going back to the winners of our guild member competition for the Lawful Evil video of Alignment Done Right. Last time we did the request video on guiding character creation. This week, we're going to be doing the request from guild member Nick Uroseva of Derailed Games. Be sure to check him out. I'll put a link down in the, how they say, doobly-doo. But for Nick, we're going to be discussing how to pace an adventure versus pacing a campaign. So, pacing in RPGs requires two things: understanding and improv. What you need to understand are several variables. You need to understand your players, particularly their experience level and their interests. You need to understand your system, and particularly what in your system is fast-paced versus what in your system slows down your game session. You need to know your genre that you're running your game in, such as horror or fantasy or war, and know the ins and outs of what it takes to tell a good story in that genre. And then finally, you need to know at least the theory behind the tension release cycle. Now, the tension release cycle has been discussed in depth by many people in pretty much any storytelling medium, whether that's writing stories in comic books and movies, even in video games. And it has even been discussed in tabletop role-playing games. But you need to have an idea of how it works in order to pace your adventure or your campaign properly. Now, I can't go in depth on it today because I could fill up an entire video just on that, but I'm going to add some links down below for you to check out for some additional reading, one of which is a video from Extra Credits on this exact topic. Though it applies mostly to video games, a lot of what they talk about, it gives you the general idea. Also, there's another link down below to a blog whose name is escaping me at the moment, but I like this take, so that'll be down there. That blog goes into it in depth and how it applies to role-playing games, or at least how it can apply to role-playing games. Be sure to read those if you're very concerned about your pacing, because they'll give you good ideas on how to change things up. But for now, the gist of the tension release cycle is that there are peaks and valleys in storytelling, and even in interactive storytelling like we're involved with. Essentially, you can't have things be scary, exciting, funny, or sad all the time. Otherwise, they start to lose their meaning. You can't have a horror game where it's just constant gore and monsters and 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 gore and monsters, because even as the words start to lose meaning for me saying that, it's the same for your players. That mood just starts to going away. As human beings, we're designed that, we'll adjust to things. And when you get a constant scare or constant excitement level or constant battle, we just get used to it and it starts losing its meaning for us. It's no longer notable for us. So you need to have periods in your story and in your events where you have high points and low points. You have a build-up to a high point where you have your exciting moment or your scary moment, and then you have a drop in the tension where you have some breathing room before you start building back up to the next one, which is preferably higher than the last until you reach your peak for the adventure. A little bit more on that later, but that's the gist of it, is that there are high points and low points with build-up and breathing room between the two. Next, improv. Now, this is just a basic skill for any good game master, is being able to improvise based upon what your players do. But more specifically in this case, instead of just improving what an NPC says or what their name is or the description of a room, you need to be able to improv the composition of scenes, as well as be able to include new scenes when necessary. You need to be able to come up with scenes and scene composition on the fly, be able to adjust your story on the fly based upon what your players are doing in order to, introduce, let's say, for example, you got players that are, they were supposed to go into a scene that builds the tension towards the battle with a monster outside the city that you were working with. Instead, they chose to pursue a low-tension route, say just going shopping to buy what they need that they forgot about from a previous adventure. That's low tension, and that can break what, the buildup that you were doing there. Sure, you could just let them get done and come back, but, it kind of broke the pacing from what you were building up before. Well, that's just if you don't improvise. If you do improvise, what you do is while they're off shopping out there, introduce scenes that can still add to that buildup for it. Maybe they come across somebody or they overhear talk about said monster outside the walls. It doesn't even necessarily have to be true. It doesn't have to be terribly big, but just introduce that little nugget into their brain so that you have that little bit of buildup during that otherwise downtime moment. You need to be able to come up with those scenes on the fly in order to keep your build-up for your high points, or even for dropping it from when they are all hyped up and whatnot. Be able to introduce some levity into a scene where they're all hyped up and you need to give them release when they otherwise didn't feel the climax of the scene. For those of you that think that sounds daunting, it's okay. Don't feel bad. Your skill in improv improves over time. It improves with experience. Pretty much as you try this, you will get better at it. The best advice I can give you for improv, until I eventually get around to doing a how to improve your improv video, is just be well prepared, keep lots of notes and things, have tools available to help you come up with ideas, and practice at it. Either, practice just coming up with stories or coming up with characters, write down different ideas, just practice coming up with ideas on the fly, and like I said, you'll get it with experience as you practice it. But, the theory of that, okay, I need to improv and I need to understand, these variables, but Dan, what do I actually do to work on the pacing in my game? Well, as I said before with the title of this video, there's a difference between pacing an adventure versus pacing a campaign. See, an adventure is a contained storytelling experience. It's an interactive experience that can expand beyond the story arc, but it is a contained experience. There is a story arc that starts and stops. Whereas a campaign is ongoing. It's not so much about the adventure, but about the characters' lives. Now, some GMs will have multiple adventures strung along and call that a campaign. Well, it's not really a campaign so much as it's like I think Pathfinder calls them adventure paths, because a campaign includes that downtime. It takes the concept of the adventure and makes that adventure only part of their life. You have that downtime where your players will explore their civilian lives. But, how does that differentiate in the pacing then between those two things? Well, actually, you might have already started to pick up on it, but now, an adventure, the way you pace that is actually just traditional storytelling pacing. You'll see it in, some of the additional reading that I gave you, where they talk about how you build up to it. It's essentially you start with high tension, a really exciting scene, and then you go to, and then you have your low point, and you go up to another scene, and then you have another low point, and you build up to another scene, and essentially you start building tension up and up until you reach an uber peak, pretty much the peak of the adventure, the climactic battle, the big moment of the adventure, and then you have your resolution, which ends the story arc. But otherwise, all your peaks and valleys are actually building up to that one point before you get your big resolution. That's an adventure pacing. You start out in action, you start out catching their interest, and then you go back low, and then you start building it up little by little with little plot points to build up to that big climactic battle or that big climactic exchange or whatever exciting thing to finish that, whether it's a battle or even just taking Halo out, off the top of my head, escaping from the exploding spaceship. Whatever your peak point of excitement is, you're building up to that before the final resolution. That's adventure pacing. Again, you'll get more of that in the additional reading. But as for pacing a campaign, that's a little bit different. For one thing, you don't start high. You start actually low. You start slow because when you are dealing with the adventurers or the characters, everyday lives, they have everyday lives, and they need to start in their everyday life. You might be able to start with a little high, or maybe with a first adventure, if you like, but only if you have players that are experienced. Pretty much, I'll touch on this again in just a second, but you want to start out slow. You only want to start out with a high point if you have experienced players. Otherwise, you want to start out slow, establish what their everyday life is like, then go into your first adventure. Maybe even do a couple of mini non sequitur adventures. But otherwise, what you're looking at in a campaign for pacing is you start out slow, and then you have downtime between each adventure. Because what you're going to run into is, in the campaign, the big adventures they're the peaks in the characters' lives. They are the high points. Those are the exciting parts of their lives. Then, once you hit that, you need to have a period of downtime where you let them explore their civilian or their everyday lives. Let them pursue their lives outside of being adventurers. Do they own a tavern? Do they maybe start up other businesses? Do they pursue love? Do any of them get married or have kids? Or do they have any non-adventuring related stuff, business to deal with? Family issues, anything like that. Let them explore their day-to-day lives between adventures, and that way you have the adventure, which is the high point, and then you have the low point of the everyday life. So when it comes to the end of that everyday life period, that breathing period, you get to where another adventure starts ramping up again. They're like, all right, okay, I'm ready. Let's do this. I'm great. They get excited for it. That adventure is more notable because you have a base point. You have a breathing level for the everyday lives of the players. Plus, if you end up in a proper campaign that lasts years, like the one that I was in, you'll end up with generations of characters and lots of adventures to go back and talk about. I'll talk again about that later, but I want to move on from deciding whether or not you're going to do an adventure in a campaign. Those are the general differences between the two. Next, you want to take notes, both on your players and on your system. On your players, pretty much you're building your understanding of your players and of the system. For your players, you want to know their experience level. If you have newer people, and this is what I talked about a little bit ago, you do not want to start with that really exciting point. At least so long as it isn't mechanic heavy. Pretty much with newer players, if you start mechanic heavy, like drop them in the middle of a combat, where, especially in D20 system or the hero system, something that is a lot of mechanics and stuff that they're just getting hit with right off the bat, they're going to get frustrated and they're going to lose interest very quickly. Just because you're shotgunning information at them and they don't have enough time to get immersed into the excitement of what's happening. If you do want to start high with new players, keep it cinematic. Let them make choices, but take mechanics out of the situation. Let them get immersed in the situation that they can get involved in the excitement of what's going on. Otherwise, if you have experienced players, by all means, start them out in an epic combat just to catch their interest. And then, go immediately to the drop-off and start building up properly just like normal. But you also want to keep in mind their interests so that you can actually pick the proper system and genre, the proper type of story to tell them. If you have players who aren't comfortable with sexual themes or themes of drugs, for whatever reason, then obviously you want to steer away from stories or plot elements that depend on those. Or at least color them a little bit lighter so that they're not offensive for your players. You want to establish this early so you understand what type of story you're building and what type of scenes you can work with when you're improvising new scenes for the build-up and for the resolution, for the tension and for the release. Next, you want to know your genre, the ins and outs of that, what type of scenes and what types of highs and lows really help build that. For example, horror has a very specific way of building tension and release. excuse me, like I mentioned, you can't just do horror, gruesome, terrible stuff all the time. In fact, one of the best ways to build tension in horror is to completely leave the player alone once you've established that something terrible is going on and something terrible could happen to them. Because then their brain starts working and they start building all the suspense themselves. Versus, say an action thing where you can't just leave them alone because otherwise it's going to kill their immersion in the stuff that's going on. You need to have them building up by getting information up to that fight, maybe being intimidated up to that fight. You can't just leave them alone to think about it, because then once they go into that battle, they're no longer going to be excited. Now they're going to be thinking about it more, maybe more from a board game standpoint. They're not really immersed in it anymore. Now they might be looking at it more meta. So you need to learn how good stories are told in the genre that you're telling your story in. But also, you need to learn your system. You need to take notes on your system and learn what in your system leads to fast-paced gameplay and what in your system what slows it down in a session. Because you can use those in each individual session to work out arcs in that story. Pretty much when you need a scene to be fast-paced, you can introduce that fast-paced gameplay. If say in the system, combat is very quick, it's very impactful, it's very exciting, you can use an encounter for, either building tension or for a quick excitement thing to build up to a higher peak. Or if, say, like in some systems, combat just crawls to a near stop because there's just so much involved, then if you're trying to go for an exciting scene, you probably don't want to do combat. You probably want to save your exciting scene for running away or doing things under pressure, versus, throwing in a combat that, even though in theory, in the story, it should be exciting, but to your players, all right, I'll do this. Kind of breaks tension. You see what I'm saying? So you want to get to know your system and take some notes so you know what's fast-paced in the system, what's slow in the system, and then use those for your tension building and your release scenes accordingly. A battle scene a battle encounter in a slow-moving system can be used as a release, can be used as breathing room for players. Keep that in mind when you're thinking about this. But then, of course, you need to know the tension release cycle. But I already mentioned that before. Essentially, just do the additional reading and maybe search some videos on it, and you'll get a better idea of how that works. There's lots of different ways to do that out there. Lastly, once you know whether or not you're going to be running an adventure or a campaign or even just a couple of adventures, and once you've built your understanding of your players, your genre, your system, and how to build a good story arc with peaks and valleys, the last thing you need to do is, plan out your story arc. Plan out your story for the adventure or for the latest adventure, or for the meta adventure, the overarching adventure. Go ahead and start planning it out. Base it on the state of the world as well as your player's current situation or their starting situation. And the most important thing I can say with that when you're planning out your adventure is be prepared to adjust it. You're going to have to improvise. Every good GM knows that players will completely wreck what you have planned. They'll come up to that completely obvious plot point, and turn left and go that way. Be prepared to adjust and run with it on the fly. You got to be able to improv not just characters and places, but also improv story flow. So be prepared to adjust your story arc. A couple of final thoughts before I leave you off today, because this is starting to go on a little long. The tension release cycle, also, let's say you're running a campaign, it goes from macro to micro, and this also applies to an extent to adventures as well. The tension release goes from macro to micro. So, as I described before, in a campaign, you have your peaks and your valleys, your peaks being the adventures and the valleys being the civilian life of the players. That's on the macro scale. That's looking at campaign life over years in and out of game. Then you go to the adventures. Your adventures still have that normal story structure where you got peaks and valleys building up to one big peak and then one big resolution. going back into the low point of your campaign. But that also applies to a single session. Ideally, your session is you're looking at starting at a low point and then going up to an exciting point of the session and going back to a resolution for the session, whether that resolution is small or big. Now, when I say that, a lot of people think, oh, well, that means I have to have a combat in every session, or, oh, there has to be some big revelation in every session. No, that's not the case. Just because a peak is small doesn't mean there's not a peak. Even if in a single session, all your players did was get a single clue that built up to a peak that's coming up in the adventure, that's your peak in the session. If one exciting thing happened or one amusing thing happened, one peak moment that just built up and then there was release after that, that's your peak in the session. The ideal session will have a peak in it. And those sessions will build up in the adventure, and then that adventure will build up in the overall campaign life. So remember that it's not just on the macro scale, it also goes down to the micro scale. Even in a combat, you'll have they go into combat, they might be excited, but, then they start getting in the nitty-gritty of it, maybe start to worry, and then you have the peak moment where somebody does something awesome or somebody slays them, and then you have the aftermath of the combat, which is your resolution. So it does go from macro to micro or micro to macro, however you want to look at it. But you will find peaks in even the smallest portions of it. And ideally you want that. You don't just want it to be, level right across. You want to have peaks and valleys pretty much in everything, because it builds up to the larger peaks and valleys. Secondly, for the campaign play, for pacing your campaigns, how I've mentioned you need to go back to their civilian lives in order to have your valley after your adventure peaks. Well, that can end up feeling episodic. You can end up where, it starts feeling for the players that, all right, what are we doing this month? Or, they might not feel like there's a continuity between them. They might feel that the story is episodic or non sequitur. Well, in order to really help them feel immersed in the fact that they're living out their characters' lives, you need to have each adventure affect their civilian or their daily life afterwards. Part of that resolution coming off of that adventure should be seeing how, going on that adventure, how it changed the player's well, not the player. It might change the player's lives, but how it changed the player characters' lives, how it affects their day-to-day life. Whether that's being a player character died and now we have to mourn him, or, we beat the big tyrannical king that was ruling over the land and, punishing people. Well, he's gone now. Now we get to see what happens in the aftermath, who comes to power, how that affects the citizenry, whether for good or for ill. Every adventure should change their day-to-day lives, should affect it in a permanent manner, until it might be changed by a next adventure. But it should affect their day-to-day lives, so it feels like they accomplished something, that they changed them. They should feel like the character that they started with is not the same as the character 5 adventures down the road, because they've gone through the changes from each individual adventure. But now, like I said in the beginning, this is a very large topic. A lot of people have talked on this a lot, so maybe there was something that I left out, or maybe, you disagreed with something I had to say. If so, please feel free to leave a comment below. Please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep the conversation going. And as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.